Caleb watched from the tree line as the bears shredded his only map and his last chance at survival. Dehydrated and hallucinating, he stumbled into a derelict shack built into the cliffside. He woke to the impossible sound of rushing water and followed the pipes to a concealed steel door. Below the floorboards, a massive bunker hummed with the sound of a silent generator and the cries of those the world had forgotten. He came to the mountain to find himself, but he found a cage filled with stolen lives, and the masters were coming back. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. The mountains don't care how many miles you have under your boots or how many peaks you have conquered. For Caleb, a 55-year-old veteran of the high country, that was a lesson he thought he had already mastered. He was 3 days into a solo week-long trek, deep in the rugged veins of the Arizona range, where the air is thin and the silence is heavy. He loved the isolation. He loved the way the world narrowed down to the weight of his pack and the rhythm of his breath. But the wilderness has a way of reminding you that you are just a visitor, and usually, it does it when you are feeling the most invincible. It happened on the third morning, just as the first gray light was beginning to bleed over the ridges. Caleb was still in his sleeping bag, drifting in that half-conscious space between dreams and reality, when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a wet, heavy rustling right outside his tent flap. His heart did a slow, painful roll in his chest. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He reached out a trembling hand and peeled back the nylon just an inch. There, not 6 feet away, was a family of grizzlies. They weren't just passing through. They were systematic. One of the smaller cubs was already pawing at his bear canister, while the mother, a massive wall of dark fur and muscle, was sniffing the very fabric of his tent. Caleb realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that he had made a mistake. He had kept a small stash of dried fruit inside his pack, and to a hungry bear, that was an invitation. He knew he couldn't go out the front. If he stepped out there, he was just a slow-moving snack. He moved with a frantic, silent grace. He reached for his boots, sliding his feet into the cold leather without tying the laces. His hands fumbled for his pocket knife, the only tool he had within reach. With a shaking blade, he sliced a jagged horizontal line through the back of the tent wall. He didn't grab his heavy pack. He didn't grab his GPS or his satellite phone. He just rolled out into the dirt, feeling the sharp bite of the morning frost on his skin. He didn't look back. He scrambled on all fours into the thick brush, his lungs burning with the cold air. Behind him, he heard the sickening sound of nylon tearing and the heavy thud of his supplies being scattered across the campsite. Everything that made him a master of the mountains, his maps, his fire starter, his extra layers, was being shredded by claws that could snap a pine branch like a toothpick. He kept moving, putting distance between himself and the noise, until his legs gave out and he collapsed against a granite boulder. He was alive, but he was a ghost. He was standing in the middle of a wilderness that was beginning to wake up, and he had absolutely nothing. No water, no food, no way to call for help. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in small nicks from the brush, the blood already starting to dry in the arid air. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. He realized then that he wasn't just lost. He was being hunted by the very environment he had spent his life admiring. The dehydration set in faster than he expected. By midday, the sun was a white-hot hammer, beating against his skull. Every step felt like he was lifting lead weights. He started to hallucinate, seeing the shimmer of water in the dry creek beds and hearing the phantom ring of a cell phone that was miles away, buried under a pile of bear droppings. He was an underdog now, a man stripped of his legend and reduced to a primal struggle for his next breath. He climbed higher, driven by a desperate, illogical hope that a higher vantage point would show him a way out. His vision was blurring at the edges, the world turning into a smear of gray and brown. He reached a clearing near a steep cliffside and stopped. He wanted to scream, but all that came out was a dry wheeze. He looked out over the valley, and that's when he saw it. A small, slanted roof tucked into a notch in the mountain wall. It looked old. The wood grayed by decades of storms, But it was shelter. It was his last hope. And if he didn't reach it before the sun went down, he knew he would never wake up to see the next one. He began the descent, but his body was failing him. He slipped on loose shale, tumbling 20 feet down a scree slope. The rocks tore at his palms and shins, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the singular, driving need to reach that shed. It was a 2-hour scramble that felt like a lifetime. As he got closer, he saw that there was no path leading to it. No boot prints, no broken branches, no signs of life. It was a dead place. The darkness didn't fall. It crashed over the mountain. By the time he reached the wooden walls, he was blind, navigating by touch alone. He felt the rough, splintered grain of the siding under his fingernails. His hand swept across the cold metal of a latch. He pulled, and the door gave way with a low, heavy groan that sounded like a warning. He fell inside, the air smelling of dust and something sharp, like ozone. He didn't search the room. He didn't look for a light. He just collapsed onto the floor, his face pressed against the cold, gritty wood, and let the blackness take him. He was too exhausted to realize that he wasn't alone in the mountain, and the thing he had found wasn't just a shed. Caleb lay on the floor of the shed, his consciousness drifting like smoke. The silence of the mountain was absolute, a heavy shroud that seemed to press the very air from his lungs. In his feverish state, he imagined he could hear the mountains grinding together, the ancient rock whispering about the man who had come there to die. He was beyond shivering. His body had moved into a state of quiet preservation, pulling all its remaining heat toward his core. Every time he drifted off, he saw the face of the mother bear, her dark eyes reflecting a primal hunger that felt like a mirror to his own thirst. He woke again in the deep middle of the night, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He tried to move his arm, but it felt like a heavy, rusted piston. The darkness inside the shed was so thick he couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the legs of an old wooden table. It felt brittle, the wood sapless and dead. He wasn't thinking about survival anymore. He was just thinking about the sensation of water hitting the back of his throat. He thought about the rivers he had crossed, the cold mountain springs he had taken for granted just days before. He dragged himself across the floor, his fingernails catching on the rough planks. He was looking for anything: a discarded bottle, a leak in the roof, a patch of damp earth. But the shed was dry as a tomb. He felt a metal latch on a low cabinet and pulled it open, but his hands only found dust and the brittle remains of a spiderweb. He slumped against the back wall, his head thudding against the timber. He was an expert hiker, a man who had taught survival courses to people half his age, yet here he was, failing at the very basics of life. The injustice of it burned in his chest. He hadn't been reckless. He had been blindsided by a force of nature that didn't follow the rules of his guidebooks. He thought about his friends back in the city, probably sitting in a warm bar, checking their phones and wondering why he hadn't sent his daily update. They would wait another 4 days before they even called the rangers. By then, Caleb knew he would be part of the mountain's history, another cautionary tale for the next generation of hikers who thought they were masters of the wild. He felt a strange, vibrating hum in the wall behind his head. At first, he thought it was his own pulse, the thumping of a heart that was running out of fuel. But it was too rhythmic, too mechanical. It was a low-frequency buzz that seemed to come from deep within the rock itself. He pressed his ear to the wood, the vibration rattling his teeth. It was an impossible sound for a derelict shed in the middle of nowhere. It sounded like power. It sounded like a heart made of steel and copper. He reached up. His hand fumbled blindly along the wall until he touched something cold and smooth. It was a pipe. He followed it with his fingertips, feeling the condensation on the metal. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a knob, a circular handle that was slick with moisture. He turned it with the last of his strength, the metal groaning as it yielded. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a sputtering hiss echoed in the dark, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of air being pushed through a line. A sudden burst of liquid hit his hand. Caleb didn't wait to check if it was clean. He pressed his mouth to the source, the cold water exploding against his parched throat. It was the sweetest, most painful sensation he had ever known. He drank until his stomach cramped, until his breath came in ragged gasps, and still he didn't move away. As the water flowed, the low hum in the wall grew louder, as if the act of using the faucet had triggered a sleeping giant. Caleb sat back, the water dripping from his chin onto his torn shirt. He was still in the dark, still lost, and still miles from civilization, but the logic of the mountain had shifted. This shed wasn't abandoned. It was a mask. And as the first light of dawn began to gray the cracks in the walls, Caleb realized that the nightmare of the bears was just the beginning of a much deeper, more calculated horror. He watched the shadows retreat, revealing a room that was far too clean for a place that didn't exist on any map. The morning light didn't just arrive, it invaded. Sharp, golden needles of sun pierced through the gaps in the cedar planks, illuminating a billion dancing dust motes that hung in the stagnant air. Caleb sat against the back wall, his eyes stinging as they adjusted to the sudden glare. His mouth still tasted of the metallic, ice-cold water that had saved his life, but the relief was already being replaced by a cold, prickling unease. He looked at the faucet. It was a high-end brushed nickel fixture, the kind you'd see in a Scottsdale kitchen, not a mountain shack. It sat there, defiant and gleaming against the rotting wood, a piece of the modern world that had no business being in a place the map called empty. He stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling. His legs were shaky, but the hydration had cleared the fog from his mind. He began to pace the small perimeter of the shed, his boots thudding softly on the floorboards. The space was tiny, maybe 10 by 10, and mostly empty. There was a single wooden chair with a broken spindle and a small table covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. But as he moved toward the back corner, the sound of his footsteps changed. The solid thud turned into a hollow, echoing drum. Caleb knelt, his hands sweeping across the floor. He wasn't looking for supplies anymore. He was looking for the source of that mechanical hum that still vibrated through the soles of his boots. He found a small recessed ring pull hidden under a pile of old burlap sacks. He tugged at it, expecting a crawl space or a root cellar. Instead, a heavy section of the floor swung upward on silent hydraulic hinges. Below it wasn't dirt. It was a concrete shaft, perfectly square, with a steel ladder descending into a well of artificial light. "What the hell?" he whispered, the slang slipping out in a raspy breath. He looked back at the open door of the shed. He could walk out right now. He could try to find the trail, head south toward the highway, and hope his luck held out. But he knew he wouldn't make it 5 miles without real food and a map. The ladder represented a different kind of survival. It was a curiosity loop he couldn't close. He stepped onto the first rung, the steel cold and solid under his grip. As he descended, the air changed. The dry, pine-scented heat of the Arizona morning vanished, replaced by a climate-controlled chill that smelled of filtered air and expensive floor wax. At the bottom of the ladder, he found himself in a small vestibule. Ahead was a heavy metal door with a keypad that glowed a soft, menacing red. Caleb reached out, his finger hovering over the buttons. But before he could touch them, the lock clicked with a heavy magnetic thunk. The door swung open an inch. It wasn't an invitation. It was a malfunction, or perhaps just a terrifyingly confident lack of concern for intruders. He pushed the door open and froze. The space beyond was massive, carved directly into the granite heart of the mountain. This wasn't a bunker or a survivalist's pantry. It was a luxury terminal. The walls were lined with polished stone, and the floor was a seamless stretch of dark, industrial tile. In the center of the room sat a row of high-end servers, their cooling fans creating that low-frequency hum he had heard through the floorboards. Caleb walked deeper into the facility, his heart hammering against his ribs. He passed a kitchenette stocked with enough high-calorie rations to feed a small army for a year. He grabbed a protein bar, his fingers tearing at the wrapper with a desperate, animalistic hunger. As he ate, he scanned the room. There were couches, a large television, and a wall of monitors that flickered with black and white images. He walked toward the screens, expecting to see weather data or maybe surveillance of the surrounding peaks. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. The monitors were showing interiors. Small, white-walled rooms, each no larger than a walk-in closet. Most were empty, containing only a cot and a single, bolted-down chair. But on the third screen, he saw a child, a boy, maybe 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring blankly at a wall. The injustice of it hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He had spent his life protecting these mountains, believing they were a place of purity and escape. Now he realized he was standing in the belly of a monster. This shed wasn't a hunter's secret or a wealthy man's hideout. It was a processing center, a place where the stolen were kept before they were moved into the shadows of the world. Caleb looked at the protein bar in his hand and felt a sudden violent urge to vomit. He wasn't just a lost hiker anymore. He was a witness to a crime that made the bears in the woods look like household pets. He moved to the control desk, his hands shaking as he touched the keyboard. He didn't know how to hack a system, but the interface was open, left in a state of arrogant standby. He found a log, a list of dates and units moved through the facility over the last 6 months. The numbers were staggering. Dozens of names, most of them children, tagged with destination codes he didn't recognize. Just as he reached for a satellite phone sitting on the charging dock, he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice. It wasn't coming from the monitors. It was coming from the shaft above. The heavy thud of a car door slamming shut, followed by the muffled sound of voices. The masters of the house were home, and Caleb was trapped in a luxury cage with no way out but the ladder he had just climbed. He realized then that the survival he had fought for in the desert was nothing compared to the fight that was about to begin in the dark. Caleb stood paralyzed, the half-eaten protein bar falling from his hand. The muffled voices from above weren't the confused shouts of hikers. They were the low, rhythmic tones of men doing a job. He looked at the heavy steel door he had just entered. If he tried to climb back up the ladder, he'd be climbing directly into their arms. His only choice was to go deeper. He grabbed the satellite phone, its weight a cold promise of salvation, and shoved it into his pocket. He needed to find a place to vanish. The bunker didn't just contain a surveillance hub. It was a sprawling network of utility corridors and holding zones. He slipped into a side hallway, his back pressed against the cold granite wall. The air here was even colder, humming with the invisible power of a massive backup generator. He passed a heavy door labeled life support and another that led to a dark, high-ceilinged room filled with rows of black plastic crates. He didn't have to open them to know they weren't filled with hunting trophies. His footsteps were silent on the tile as he followed a flickering LED light toward the back of the facility. He reached a second control station, this one smaller and tucked away in a corner. He looked at the screens again. The boy he had seen earlier was still there, but now a second monitor showed the interior of the shed above. 2 men in tactical gear were standing over the open hatch, peering down into the shaft. One of them pointed a flashlight toward the floor, the beam reflecting off the water Caleb had spilled from the faucet. "He's down there," one of the men said, his voice piped through the console speakers with terrifying clarity. "Nobody uses the tap unless they're looking for a way in. Secure the perimeter." Caleb's throat tightened. He realized then that the malfunction of the door hadn't been an accident. It was a lure. They had let him descend so they could corner him where the mountain would muffle his screams. He began to navigate the computer system with a frantic speed, his fingers flying over the keys. He found the security override for the entire sector. If he could lock them out of the lower levels, he might buy himself enough time to find a second exit or get a signal out on the phone. As the locks engaged with a series of heavy metallic thuds that echoed through the mountain, Caleb found the folder marked Transport Schedule. He realized the scale of the operation was global. This mountain was just a waypoint, a silent gap in the map where lives were processed like cargo. The injustice made his vision swim with rage. These men had turned a place of natural wonder into a tomb for the living. He found a sub-level map that showed an old mining tunnel that had been reinforced and converted into an emergency egress. It led to a natural cave opening on the opposite side of the ridge, nearly a mile away. He downloaded the coordinates to the satellite phone, his hands shaking. He had to move. He could hear the men above trying to force the hydraulic hatch, the sound of metal grinding against metal. He sprinted down the final corridor, the emergency lights turning the world a sickly shade of red. He reached the heavy metal door at the end of the hall, but it didn't have a keypad. It had a manual wheel. He threw his weight into it, his muscles screaming after days of dehydration and trauma. The wheel turned an inch, then two. With a final, agonizing heave, the seals broke with a hiss of pressurized air. He stepped into the mining tunnel, the smell of damp earth and bat guano, a welcome relief after the sterile stench of the bunker. He turned back for one last look at the monitors. The men were through the hatch. They were descending the ladder, their weapons drawn. Caleb didn't wait. He slammed the wheel back into place, locking the egress from the outside. He was back in the dark, back in the wild, but this time he wasn't just a victim. He had the evidence, he had the location, and he had the names of those who thought the mountains could keep their secrets. The mining tunnel was a jagged throat of cold stone and damp air that felt like it was trying to swallow Caleb whole. He fumbled for the flashlight he had snagged from the shed's upper cabinet, its weak beam cutting a pathetic yellow path through the ancient dark. Behind him, the heavy thuds against the egress door echoed like distant thunder. Those men weren't going to stop. They knew that if Caleb reached the sunlight with that satellite phone, their billion-dollar operation was finished. He scrambled over piles of loose shale, his boots slipping on the slick, wet floor of the tunnel. He reached the end of the shaft where the reinforced concrete gave way to raw, unhewn granite. The satellite phone in his pocket felt like a brick of pure ice, a weight that reminded him of the faces he had seen on those monitors. He wasn't just running for his life anymore. He was running for theirs. He reached a vertical chimney in the rock, the smell of fresh pine and cold mountain air drifting down from far above. It was a climb that would have challenged him even when he was at full strength, but now, with his body battered and his mind frayed, it felt impossible. "Move," he hissed to himself, the word cracking in his dry throat. He jammed his fingers into a narrow fissure, the stone biting into his raw skin. He hauled himself up, inch by agonizing inch, his muscles burning with a fire that seemed to consume the last of his energy. Every time he slipped, he thought of the boy sitting cross-legged in that windowless room, waiting for a savior who might never come. That was the fuel he needed. The injustice of that mountain cage pushed him higher than any peak he had ever conquered. He broke through the surface into a thicket of manzanita and mountain laurel. The transition was jarring. One moment he was in the bowels of a high-tech hell, and the next, he was surrounded by the indifferent beauty of the Arizona wilderness. He didn't stop to admire the view. He checked the satellite phone. It had 3 bars of signal. He didn't call his friends, and he didn't call the local rangers. He dialed a direct line to a federal task force contact he had met years ago through his survival workshops. "I found it," Caleb gasped into the receiver, his voice barely a whisper. "The dead zone, Sector 4. They've got a bunker under the old hunter's shed. There are kids, at least half a dozen on site. Send everyone." He spent the next 2 hours moving through the high ridges, staying off the visible trails and sticking to the shadows of the boulders. He watched from a high outcropping as 3 unmarked black helicopters swept over the mountain, their rotors thumping like the heartbeat of a vengeful god. He saw the flashbangs ignite near the shed, a sudden, violent burst of white light that signaled the beginning of the end for the facility. The rescue operation was surgical. By the time Caleb hiked down to the base of the ridge where the tactical teams had set up a perimeter, the metal hatch had been breached, and the masters of the house were being let out in zip ties. He sat on the bumper of an armored vehicle, a thick wool blanket draped over his shoulders and a bottle of water in his hand. He watched as a small group of children were led out of the mountain, their eyes squinting against the harsh morning sun. They looked frail, confused, and terrified, but they were alive. The investigation revealed that the shed was part of a global network, a silent artery that had been pumping stolen lives through the wilderness for years. The authorities permanently sealed the bunker, pouring tons of concrete into the shafts to ensure the mountain would never be used as a cage again. While the men on site were arrested, the wealth behind the operation was so vast that many of the higher-ups vanished into the fog of international shell companies. But the mountain itself was finally clean. Caleb returned to those peaks 6 months later. People told him he was crazy, that he should stay in the city where the ground was flat and the water came from a tap he could trust. But he knew the mountain wasn't the monster. The men who hid inside it were. He hiked back to the clearing where the shed once stood. There was nothing left but a patch of fresh dirt and the beginnings of new grass. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind. It didn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounded like a long, slow breath of relief. He had gone into the woods to find himself, and he had come out as the only man who could hear the mountains scream. Caleb survived the bears and the desert heat, but he couldn't survive the silence. He chose to speak, and in doing so, he tore the heart out of a mountain nightmare. Because in the wild, the only thing more dangerous than a predator is a man with nothing left to lose and a truth that needs to be told. If you believe that no one should ever be left behind in the dark, hit that subscribe button and share this story. We bring the light to the places that want to stay hidden. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and stay safe. If you believe that the darkest corners of the world deserve to be dragged into the light, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't let these stories of survival and justice fade into the mountain mist. Join our community today to ensure that the voices of the lost are always heard. Disclaimer. Disclaimer. This program is for entertainment purposes only. While this narrative is modeled after structural patterns found in survival and discovery accounts, the characters, specific locations, and criminal plot details have been fictionalized for dramatic impact. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real-world events is purely coincidental. The survival tactics and legal outcomes depicted are for storytelling purposes and should not be taken as professional advice or factual reporting.